Okay, so we're the QT team. We're presenting our solution, My Data Hub, which is your personalized digital identity, which you can use as a single sign-on service across all the accredited sites. So the main issues we saw here was that it's really difficult to gain and sustain the attention of consumers, particularly with the complex financial decisions, leading to that status quo bias of sticking with what you know. Now, the way we're going to address this is by raising awareness and understanding of the consumer data right, also for what that means for them. And then make it super easy to engage with the third-party sites in a easy manner and also very transparent way, resulting in repeated switching behaviours and greater consumer welfare.
All right, so we broke our challenges down into two sort of sections. The first section is temporal sensitivity, social effects, and loss aversion, and the second one looks at procrastination, status quo bias, and information complexity. So in the first case, we have temporal sensitivity. We know that people affected by temporal landmarks, such as New Year's or your tax time. We also know that people have social effects. They want to belong in the social norm. They want to be part of the average. And then we know that people are loss averse. If you tell them they're going to be losing the data, it induces loss aversion. So the takeaway from this is that creative strategies need to be used to gain attention. In our second stage, we have procrastination, status quo bias, and information complexity. Procrastination is, I'll do it now. No, I won't do it now, I'll do it later. So you have planning fallacy. Then you have the status quo bias. It's easier to stay with what I'm doing because it's too complex. And if it's too complex, I'm going to use my heuristics to fill in the information gaps. So what you need to do is present information simply and very clearly. Now, we are targeting all Australians, and in doing so, what we did was we went and looked at Australian consumers. We surveyed 138 Australian consumers, and we presented them with two different scenarios. In the first one, we asked them about switching or staying in a restaurant, and as you can see, there are different ways or different people they go to in order to determine whether or not they stay or switch. Now, in the second case, we asked them where they go for information, but as you can see, they go to different information compared to whether they'll switch or stay. So, you cannot have a one-size-fits-all approach to the consumer data right. There must be a combination of strategies to optimize for each industry. Now, this breaks it down even further. We believe that you need to have awareness. And in order to have awareness, you need to be able to gain attention. To gain attention, you need to play on temporal sensitivities, which leads into understanding. To have an understanding, you need to know how people learn. So policies should follow findings on how people learn best. And finally, you have consent. And you cannot have consent unless you have understanding and awareness. So you need to be ensured that people are actively making consent.
So then we look at visualising how this consumer journey might take place. To first think about their awareness of the issue, how they're going to understand it, consent to sharing their data, and finally taking action based on that. First of all, we want to embed it as part of the taxation system so that it has credibility coming from the government, but also it's at the right time of the year when people are already thinking about financial decisions. From there, they'll be automatically redirected to the My Data Hub by default, although there is the option to opt out from this redirection if they'd like to. But by setting that default, it means more people will get awareness and get exposure to My Data Hub by default. From that, our research showed that around 40% of respondents preferred videos over other forms of learning. And as a result, a simple video should explain the My Data Hub and its pros and cons for the user. From there, we want active consent. So the first step, which is pre-filling the account, is very, very simple for the consumer, which leads them to have a little bit more time and a bit of brain space to actually think about the decisions they're making and one by one actively consent to the different ways they might be sharing their data. Finally, then they can then be redirected to third-party websites where they can actually make the switching decisions on those private websites. We also have several specific communications which will be used to direct people to My Data Hub. The first of those is with a MyGov SMS text, which people might be getting already. This tells them to log on to their MyGov inbox, where they'll have a more detailed explanation of the information. And again, we rely on social norms to reinforce why they should be looking at the My Data Hub in the first place. For example, 95% of Australians want to be able to opt out from sharing certain data. Click through to take control of your data today. Finally, the one I mentioned earlier, at the bottom of the tax form, something to the effect of deselect this box or unclick this box if you want to lose control of your data, which will mean by default people will be following through to the My Data Hub website. Once we actually have a look at My Data Hub, as we visualize it, it should control all of the different industries and all of that data in one place and make it really easy for the consumer. So today we're focusing more on the financials, so we'll tap into that a little bit. As you go in, you'll be able to retrieve your banking data based on individual products or individual banks. So I can choose to just retrieve my info from Bank 1 and store that in my data hub, or maybe retrieve all the information at once and download that all to my data hub. Then I can look at the other menu options. So I can visit a third-party comparison site, take that banking data that I've just chosen, and get various selection options to switch or compare. The important thing is that I've actually one by one chosen the things that I'm happy to consent to sharing. So it's not just a blanket, I agree to everything tick box. Finally, and really, really importantly, is clear disclosure about the types of access that different third-party sites will use. And we want a universal and consistent disclosure of how this data is shared, whether there'll be advertising with third-party providers, whether your location will be stored, and it needs to be really simple for the consumer to go, okay, I understand who is using my data and how they're using it.
So the way that we look at it is comparison services that already exist on the market at the moment are doing a pretty good job of displaying complex information in a way that's easy for the consumer to understand. Where we think the government should focus their attention on is how they endorse and accredit these comparison services in the first place. So as a minimum benchmark, we think that the government should regulate that each comparison service has transparency and independence at its core. This increases the credibility, the trustworthiness, and overall the consumer confidence in the service. It also gives the consumers more understanding of how their data is being used and more control to actually consent if they would like to share their data. We also recommend that comparison services focus on outcomes instead of inputs and providing real numbers instead of percentages in order to simplify that information further for the consumer. To supplement My Data Hub, we have also looked at several marketing tactics to reinforce the switching behaviour and to optimise the consumer welfare. So complex problems aren't going to be perfect the first time they implement a solution, so testing is important. So running randomly controlled trials to test the effectiveness of communications allows us to test what the best way to drive traffic to My Data Hub is, to retain their attention and to encourage consumers to return. We've also got opt-in additional reminders, which cause higher commitment due to the self-commitment issue, temporal advertising, and because we know that people respond differently to different influences, a range of different mediums to address different aspects of the market.
So to rehash, My Data Hub is your personalized data, digital identity. So you can use to access third-party sites with the single sign-on service. Some of the benefits we see, it's affordable. So we're using existing infrastructure in terms of industry for the credibility and for industry for the efficiency.
Thanks,
You're also,
Ross.
damn.
Feel free to take this as a comment, but you are suggesting language, deselect if you want to lose control of your online data, or select yes, I want control. Given that the default is that the data will not be shared, could you comment on why you chose that particular terminology, which is pretty leading?
So if you're referring to the way that we're getting people to be auto-directed, yeah? So that's basically trying to say that we are playing on that loss aversion. So I don't think anyone wants to lose control of their data on a tax form as well. That's kind of credible. So, I mean, I wouldn't want to untick it and then lose control of my data. So we're just trying to get that awareness through to our site, basically.
So I agree, but I worry it's misleading because by not selecting it, a person is not actually losing control. They're just being passive rather than active.
Well, that's true, but we're trying to play on the loss aversion being experienced. So the terminology, if you do decide to use it, you can just tweak it yourself. So we just want to put across that you really want to make sure they're feeling loss averse to redirect.
So if I understand correctly, My Data Hub would be something hosted by the government, if I'm correct. So have you thought about, and that's quite a big task, right? And have you thought about the constraints or the implementation, or actually linking it with the tax returns? Because this might be two different departments that are working. And
Well, if you link it to your tax returns as well, not everyone has their bank account linked to a tax return. So you need to consider things with per industry. So again, telecommunications, you haven't got that linked to your tax account either. So in terms of constraints, it should be broad reaching and it should be tailored to industry.
Also, you're doing this for the benefit of the consumer, so you should see this as a valid investment in their welfare.
Thanks, guys.